encouraged to be able to learn some new songs and to sing some old songs as well and just worship the Lord together for who He is and for all He's done. Thank you all so much for being here. Take your Bibles out. Now, if you remember, a long time ago, I think it was back in October, we were in the book of Genesis, and we've been going through the book of Genesis, and I was looking back through all of my notes. We started this towards the end of 2023, so we did it all the way through 2024, almost all the way through 2025, and we're now about 33 chapters in out of 50, so we're making good progress. Maybe by 2028, 2029, we'll wrap it up. I don't know. We'll see how it works, but I've enjoyed it so far. I hope you have as well. But today we're going to be looking at a beautiful reunion. So by the way, in case you don't remember, because it's been a little while, we took a break and went through that whole Multiply Discipleship series. But let me just give you a few very quick reminders. Now we can take the whole time and just do a review on what we've looked at the past few months in this study. But we're currently going through the life of the third of the patriarchs. Now, you know the patriarchs were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We've gone through the life of Abraham. He's now dead and gone off the scene. We've gone through most of the life of Isaac. Now, he's still alive, and we're not going to see him tonight, but he is alive, and we'll encounter him very soon. He doesn't die for a couple of more chapters. But now we're focusing in on the man named Jacob, who was twin brothers with Esau. And if you remember, after he betrayed his brother, lied to his father, stole the birthright, which technically wasn't stealing, because God had told Isaac and Rebekah the birthright should go to your oldest son, your second oldest son, and they were going to give it, Isaac was going to give that to Esau anyway. Jacob manipulated some things, ended up taking the birthright for himself. Esau was furious. He says, as soon as our dad is dead, you are a dead man. And so Jacob took off running. He ran all the way to Haran, which was in the region of Padan Aram, and he landed at the home of his uncle Lot, where he worked for many years. While he was there, he first married Leah, worked 7 years for Leah, then worked 7 more years for Rachel, and then after he married Rachel, he spent 6 more years working for his uncle, where he was able to accumulate actually quite a bit of wealth. If you remember, he tricked his uncle he convinced his uncle, you take the solid colored calves that are born, I'll take the ones with spots and stripes, and then he figured out a way that he could put a steak in front of them while they were eating, and they would have calves that had spots and stripes, so he ended up accruing a massive amount of wealth. When Lot found out about it, he was furious and went to go take back what he thought was rightfully his. So they had some negotiation, and finally Jacob took off to go back home, and that's where he's on his way right now. But we're going to see this again today. He's very concerned because 20 years ago, the last thing that he had heard from his brother Esau was, as soon as dad is dead, I'm going to kill you. And Esau meant it. Now, Jacob has no idea who's alive and who's dead. Isaac was quite a bit older than Rebekah. So, as far as we know, Jacob very well could have assumed that Rebekah may still be alive, his mom, but that Isaac was long dead. In fact, back in several chapters ago, when Jacob and Esau had this big spat, Esau said, our father's on his deathbed right now. Well, 20 years have gone by, and ironically, Isaac is still alive and well. But they're heading on their way back, and he has no idea if Esau is ready to forgive or if Esau is still bound and determined to kill him. In the very last message in Genesis, we looked at Jacob, and as he's on his route back from Haran, back to the land of Beersheba, where his father lived, he saw a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. And Jacob decided to pick a fight with him. And he wrestled against God, and we know that this theophany, God who came before his incarnation, actually crippled to an extent Jacob, and Jacob learned who it was. And as we get ready to dive into our text, we probably know what it feels like to be overcome with nervousness. Sometimes we're nervous about a good thing. I remember when it was time for me to ask Leanne to be my girlfriend and then my wife. Both times I was a sweaty, nervous wreck because I didn't know what she would say. I had a generally good idea. I wasn't just taking a shot in the dark, but I was terrified out of my mind. Like, what if she rejects me? What if she says no? So that can be it. Sometimes we can get nervous because we don't know what's happening. I don't know if you're like me. Now, I've only been pulled over once in my life, many years ago, and it was because I went about 2 miles an hour through a stop sign. Which, yes, is breaking the law. I had to pay a fine. Only time I've ever been pulled over. But still to this day, when I see lights in my rearview mirror and hear a siren approaching from behind, your stomach always does this little jump, like, oh no. And so you pull over on the side of the road, which you have to do anyway, and then every time the police car goes driving past you, I'm like, okay, good, it wasn't me, right? And sometimes you sort of feel that nervous tension, like, I don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes it's a negative thing. I don't know if you've ever watched, I don't watch a lot of dramas on television that involve court trials and things like that, but I've watched some news reports. Federal trials are not videoed or anything like that, but state and local trials often are. And sometimes there will be a big-time trial on a state jurisdiction that is on television and you'll watch, and there's always that moment when all the evidence has been presented, the jury has presided, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. And finally, the jury walks back into the courtroom, and the foreman of the jury usually goes and he hands the judge the jury's decision. And the judge reads it, confers with the foreman of the jury, says, is this actually what you meant to write down? I want to make sure we're reading the right thing. And then he calls the court back into session. And of course, everyone is supposed to stand up and rise. And sometimes I imagine, what would it feel like? Thankfully, I've never been in this position. What would it feel like to be the defendant in that trial? Where maybe you know you're guilty, maybe you know you're not guilty, but regardless of your actual guilt, the rest of your foreseeable future is in the hands of that paper that the judge is about to read off of. Guilty or not guilty. And as the judge calls the court in, he has everyone rise, and he confirms with the jury that it was their decision. He opens the paper, and he reads the verdict. And I cannot imagine the nerves that you would feel in that moment as you're waiting with the next, maybe 10 years of your life hanging in the balance of what the next words out of that judge's mouth are. In our story today, we'll see Jacob facing those similar nerves, those similar butterflies. Remember, he's on a long trek back from Haran to actually bear Lahairoi or Mamre, where he would reunite with his family. The whole journey, I can imagine the nerves, the tension, knowing how he had left things, knowing how the relationship between him and his twin brother that Esau thought was great, and he had just slapped him upside the face, metaphorically speaking, and now he's heading back, and he's like, what in the world's going to happen? What is going to be the next thing on my journey? And he finally gets to the stage where the reunion's going to take place. And that's what we see. Number one, we're going to see that Jacob is racked with guilt. Jacob knew that he did what was wrong 20 years ago. And during that time of 20 years, he had largely been able to get along and probably hoped to forget what had happened with Esau. He probably hoped to forget that he had lied to his dad, that he had put goat skins with the hairs on it so that he could trick his dad into feeling his skin and thinking he was Esau, who was a lot hairier than he was. That he had put on Esau's clothes to smell like Esau. That he had literally robbed the birthright that God had promised to him anyway, but he had taken it in an unjust, dishonest way from his brother Esau. And I can only imagine the guilt that was growing the closer he got to home. Let's read about it in Genesis 33. Genesis 33. I'll give you a moment to turn there. Don't know if I told you the reference earlier, but we'll read verses 1 through 3. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children unto Leah and unto Rachel and unto the two handmaids. Remember, he had several children with Leah, the first person that he married, with Rachel, he only had one son, Joseph. Now, he would be having another son, Benjamin, but Benjamin would come along after he returned back to the land of Canaan. And he had 12 children total, 11 sons and one daughter, Dinah. But there were two other women, Zilpah and Bilhah, who also had children for him. And he gathers them all together. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost. This part fascinates me, blows my mind. I'll explain that in a minute. And Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. And he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Jacob is terrified. I can almost imagine as Jacob and his caravan, he has a large amount of herds and servants and his whole family with 12 kids, 11 sons, 1 daughter, 2 wives, and 2 girlfriends that were traveling with him. And they all get to the point where he suddenly sees Esau. And it's not just Esau. He has a small army, 400 people coming with him. And his immediate response was, he's coming to kill me. So what does he do? And this just blows my mind. We know that Jacob had favorites. Okay? We're going to see this in a few chapters later when Joseph is going out and his brothers hate him because he was Jacob's favorite. Jacob gave him a coat of many colors and no coat of many colors for the rest of them. But we see this right here. He has the maids, Bilhah and Zilpah, the 2 women that he had impregnated multiple times. They had multiple children of his. He's like, you're going to go in the front and see Esau first. And then behind you will be Leah and her kids, because she's actually my wife and everything. But then at the very back, I'm going to put Rachel and Joseph. Now, you could make the case, we know that at this point, because Benjamin wasn't born yet, that Joseph was his youngest son, so maybe that had something to do with it. I think it was more like Jacob's like, okay, if Esau comes and attacks, hopefully while he's still attacking the people up front, at least Rachel and Joseph can take off and escape to safety and he won't know any different. And which just, again, blows my mind with the whole idea of, if you're ever in a position where the captain is supposed to be the last person off the plane or the boat or whatever. But anyway, thankfully, he at least goes to the front of the line. He's like, I'm going to go up, I'm going to meet Esau, I'm going to bow down and present myself to him. And he goes to the front, and he bows himself flat on his face before Esau. And it makes me wonder, why did Jacob respond this way to Esau? Why would he go and bow 7 times before his twin brother? And really there are 2 answers I have. One, I believe, is fear. Clearly fear. Jacob was not yet confident in how Esau responded. If you look back in chapter 32, we won't take time to do that, but clearly, even as he's leaving Haran, he was afraid for his life and well-being. But I think that more than simply fear, Jacob was plagued by guilt for the wrong that he had done to his brother Esau. Jacob knew he had done wrong in deceiving his father. He knew that his brother would be angry, but more than that, he knew that honestly he deserved whatever anger his brother Esau had for him. And he knew that the consequences of his wrong choices that he had just spent 20 years running away from were finally catching up to him. But he had no idea what to expect. Sadly, we often know what this is like. We sin. And oftentimes when we sin, we have a choice. Do I confess this sin to God and get it right? Or do I cover it up, run from the consequences of my sin, and just hope it doesn't blow up on me? And that's a choice that all of us have to make. It's been tragically fascinating to watch the news really the past several months, really a year or so now. But this is something that we're seeing playing out today on the news with Jeffrey Epstein, along with Ghislaine Maxwell, 2 of the most evil people imaginable. And a lot of people, some of the wealthiest, most powerful, most famous people on this planet, chose for years to affiliate with them so that they could secretly live out their most perverted, disgusting, and decrepitly sinful desires, thinking that it would involve no consequences for them. And I can imagine those people, like Jacob as he's approaching, really started to get nervous when they heard that Epstein was arrested and put in prison and was about to stand trial. I can imagine that back in 2019 when the news hit that Epstein had, at least purportedly, committed suicide in that jail cell, a lot of them breathed a deep sigh of relief. Maybe everything that we've done in the past, that we've covered up, that we've hidden, that we had hoped would be dead, is now dead and going to be buried with Epstein, and no one will know the difference. No one will find out. Until the past year or so, when we go from there are no Epstein files, now there's over 6 million, and counting and growing, and still continuing to find out more. And still you see people doing everything in their power to cover them up, to keep them hidden, to keep them redacted. And yet we see that a lot of people are starting to realize, we've already seen university presidents and huge donors, we've seen politicians, we've seen billionaire business people, we've seen media people, we saw the former now prince in England, all of whom have been exposed by the truth coming out that they thought was going to be hidden. And you know what this should show us as Christians? Now, thankfully, I don't have the slightest thing, suspicion in my mind that any of you have ever been to Epstein Island or the Nevada Ranch or anything like that. So I'm thankful for that. But one thing that it should cause us to realize is that what God said in Numbers 32:23 is true. He said, "But if ye will not do so, behold, ye have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out." So many people have thought for years that they could cover up their sin. You read some of the emails that Epstein was sending back and forth with people, and people just openly talking about the most disgusting things, thinking that sending it to a private email, it'll get buried, never heard of again, and now they're being published for all the world to see. Jacob's realizing that in this story. He's realizing that the sins that I covered up 20 years ago, that I ran away from the consequences of, that I tried to put in my past, they now could be catching up to me. What am I going to find? But thankfully, Jacob had the right response. He left thinking, I'm going to steal the birthright and then run for my life to avoid the consequences. But 20 years later, he comes back, and we see himself bowing on his face to Esau, pleading for mercy and forgiveness, which is exactly what he should have done. And that's what we see. Number 2, we see that Esau gave him forgiveness and offered reconciliation. Genesis 33, verses 4 through 9, and Esau ran to meet him and embraced him. I assume that Jacob probably thought, worst case scenario, he'll run up and kill me and all my family. Best case scenario, he'll tell me to get lost and never come back. But he certainly never expected what Esau does. He runs up, he grabs his brother in the biggest bear hug, he fell on his neck and kissed him, and they, both of them, wept together. And he, that is Esau, lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children and said, so he asked Jacob, who are those with thee? And he said, the children which God hath graciously given thy servant. Again, Jacob's still humbling himself. He's calling me, he's saying, Esau, I am your servant. But he's saying, God has given me this wealth, God has given me these cattle, God has given me these families. He said, then the handmaids came near, they and their children, and they bowed themselves. I'm sure, I don't know if Jacob told his kids everything that he had done back with Esau, but he told them enough to say, when you meet your uncle, you better bow down and plead for mercy and forgiveness and try to make best friends with this guy, otherwise we're in trouble. And they do. And Leah also came with her children, came near and bowed themselves, and after came Joseph near and Rachel, and they bowed themselves and said, and he said that as Esau says, what meanest thou by all this drove which I met? He's like, when I came here, there's not only a family, but I also see these incredible herds of cattle that you're bringing with you too. What are these for? And he, that is Jacob, says, sometimes you got to pay attention contextually to know all the he's are referring to. But Jacob said, these are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. And Esau said, I love this. I have enough, my brother. I love how that Jacob comes and he's like, hey, I'm the servant, you're the master, you're the boss, whatever you say, you deserve it. And then Esau comes and he says, no, I'm not taking your stuff. He does eventually, because Jacob talks him into it. We'll see that in a minute. But he won't take his stuff. He says, no, and you're my brother. He says, keep that thou hast unto thyself. One thing I think we often miss, although I try to point this out, when we first looked at the story of Jacob and Rebekah deceiving Isaac, was that of all the characters in the story, Esau's the only one that we never see doing anything wrong, at least in this story. Remember, it wasn't that Esau said, hey, no, I'm going to take the birthright from Jacob. Esau grew up his whole life with his father Isaac telling him, hey, you're the firstborn, I'm going to give you the birthright. We don't see him tricking Jacob. He goes out hunting all day, comes back starving and says, hey, I need a bowl of soup. And Jacob says, oh, I'll sell you it for a birthright. He's like, sure, whatever, just give me a bowl of soup. Birthright does me no good if I starve to death. Which again, if you've ever been around teenage boys, you understand that's exactly how they think. And so he gives him the soup and he trades the birthright. But then he goes and he thinks that his dad is still going to bless him with the birthright. Probably didn't think that this handshake deal over a bowl of soup actually really meant anything. He probably thought Jacob was joking the whole time. And so then he goes and he comes back and he goes to his dad. And his dad said, hey, who are you? And Esau says, I'm Esau. You asked me to go bring you some food. And so I went and I killed you some food and I cooked it and I brought it here. And he's like, but I already ate soup. I already gave you the blessing. And Esau's like, no, I didn't cook you anything. And it turns out it was Jacob. And then he finds out, not only that, but that it was Jacob and Esau's mom, Rebekah, that had masterminded this whole thing. So Isaac did him wrong by never telling him the truth about what God had told him to do when he was born. Rebekah did him wrong by scheming and conniving putting this whole plan together to trick Isaac. Jacob did him wrong by going to his father, lying to his father, stealing the birthright. The only person that never did anything wrong was Esau until he goes and tells Jacob, I'm going to kill you as soon as my dad dies. And so this whole thing is going on. But really, he was almost the one and only good guy in the whole story. At least up to the point that he set up to kill up his brother. And yet, look at Esau's heart of forgiveness here. He ran to his brother, not waiting for Jacob to approach. He gave him a big hug and a kiss. The two of them wept together. Esau sees the women and the children. He's like, who are these? And Jacob's like, hey, I know you left, or one brother left, but I'm bringing you back 4 sister-in-laws, plus 12 nieces or 1 niece and 11 nephews. And now he was blessed with a large family. Then Esau asked about the large herds of cattle. Remember that when Jacob left Lot, he had a ton of cattle. With this whole trickery thing that he did with the stakes in the ground. And now he goes to Esau and he's like, Esau, they're all yours. And Esau's like, no, I'm not going to take anything from you. I have everything that I need. You know what we could have seen in this story? The same thing that we see so often in real life. Where one person does wrong to another person. And rather than either address it or forget it, forgive it, and move on, the person immediately feels that flash of anger. And anger often comes as a flash. It comes on quickly, and then it can leave quickly. And if you learn to forgive the person, the anger leaves and you're restored back to normal. Anger is one of those very quick, hot emotions. But if you don't deal with the anger, it then turns into a more cold, long-lasting emotion. It turns into resentment. it turns into bitterness. It turns into that rotting reality of bitterness. And understand that kind of pent-up bitterness ruins the person who is bitter more than the person they're bitter toward. But I'm thankful to see Esau's attitude here. The wrong that had been done to him, Esau's like, it's in the past, it's forgiven. All I want is for our relationship to be restored. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't looking for payment for the wrong done to him. All he was looking for was to have his relationship with his brother as it should have been 20 years prior to this. What kind of attitude do you have in your life when someone has wronged you? Do you tend to let that anger develop into resentment and bitterness toward that person? Or do you forgive? It reminds me of the story of Joseph, who's that little kid right now that Esau's like, hey, who's that kid way back there in the back of this whole family unit? And it was Joseph. And several years later, we know that Joseph was out, and he was really his father's favorite, which gave him a really bad deal. 10 of his brothers were out. Benjamin was still back home with his dad. And Joseph's job was to go and report on his brothers, and he was far too honest in doing that. He just raked his brothers over the coals, and his brothers hated him for it. So they took him. They decided at first they were going to kill him. Then they realized, well, that might be a little bit much. So they end up selling him to slavery. They took his cloak, and they tore it to pieces and soaked it in animal blood, brought it back to their father, who is Jacob, who at that point was a much older man. And they said, your son Joseph, when he was on his way out to visit us, he came up to a wild animal that tore him to pieces, and this is all that's left. And Jacob went into really the rest of his life a period of harsh, just mourning and grieving over the loss of his favorite son. Joseph goes into the land of Egypt, and when he's there, he's a slave. And you would think that life wouldn't get any worse than being a slave, but then his master's wife says, hey, I want you to sleep with me. And Joseph says no. And so she grabs his coat, and he just takes his coat off, leaves it behind, and runs out the door saying, it doesn't matter if I'm in a land hundreds of miles from my home. It doesn't matter if I'm the only person here that even worships the one true God. I cannot do the wrong thing. And he refuses to sleep with Potiphar's wife. And as a result, Potiphar's wife, people come running in, and she says, he tried to rape me. And I have his coat in my hand to prove it. And Joseph is taken and thrown in prison. But finally, we know the story, and I'm not going to give you all the details for two reasons. One, you probably already know them. Two, we're going to be getting there in a few weeks or months or years or whenever we get there here in Genesis. But in the end, he ends up rising to be second in command to Pharaoh in Egypt. His brothers have forgotten about him. In their mind, he's probably either dead or, building a pyramid somewhere in some kind of mine, just lost in oblivion. And yet they suddenly realize we're starving. There's a famine in the land. The only food available is in Egypt. They have this genius guy over there who's running this whole thing, and he somehow managed to preserve enough food that all of Egypt and everyone nearby is not starving. So they go to Egypt, and they see him, and they don't even recognize him because it was Joseph. He ends up in the whole process from keeping Benjamin, or trying to, ends up keeping Judah behind. Finally, he reveals himself, and they're like, that's Joseph. Joseph says, guys, I'm not going to hurt you. Go get Dad. They go and they bring Jacob back from Israel back into Egypt, and when they get there, he treats them kindly. And then in Genesis 50, the last chapter of the book, Jacob dies. And every one of those brothers was so ridden with their guilt because of what they knew they had done wrong that they immediately assumed that now Joseph's going to kill him. He was waiting till his dad dies, who didn't disappoint Jacob. But now that Jacob's gone, he's going to wipe him out. Look with me at Genesis 50. I put up the last verses on the screen here. It says, when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, They said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us of all the evil we did unto him. And again, they were experiencing the same guilt that Jacob himself was experiencing in Genesis 33. And they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying, Thy father did command before he died, saying, So shall ye say unto Joseph, Forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren and their sin. For they... Now, we have no idea if Jacob even said any of this. They couldn't have just been making all this up. But they're like, Dad said, you got to be nice to us. For they did unto thee evil, and now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. They're like, you got to forgive us, Joseph. Please don't kill us now. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me. But God meant it for good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. He says, God had you sell me as a slave in Egypt a couple of decades ago, just so that I would be able to save you and all of Egypt and all these people around us from starvation. He says, Now therefore fear not. I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. I was reading this passage earlier, and you know what struck me? Decades before, there was a little kid. And he had probably heard his dad warn him and say, Joseph, we're going back to Beer Lahai Roi, which is technically where Isaac was living. And when we go back, your Uncle Esau may want to kill us because I did wrong to him. I stole his birthright. So I want you to stay in the far back as you can get, and if you see him break out a sword, you grab your mom Rachel's hand, and the two of you run. And I can imagine Joseph shaking there as a leaf. And then he sees Esau coming up, sees his own dad bowing down 7 times before him, and then Esau says, Get up, and gives him that hug. And then decades later, that's exactly what Joseph does to his own brothers when they come back to Egypt. Number 3, we see restoration. Genesis 33, verses 10 through 20. And Jacob said, Now I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand. For therefore I have seen thy face as though I had seen the face of God. And thou wast pleased with me. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And then he urged him, and he took it, and said, Let us take our journey, and let us go, and I will go before thee. And he said unto him, My Lord knoweth that the children are tender, and the flocks and the herds are young with me, and if men shall overdrive them one day, all the flock will die. Let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant, and I will lead on softly, according as the cattle that goeth before me, and the children be able to endure until I come unto my Lord unto Seir. Basically what he's saying is, Esau's like, hey, you guys go ahead, and me and the 400 men that I brought with me will protect you from the rear. And Jacob's like, hey, I got 12 kids running around. I have 4 wives, or 2 wives and 2 girlfriends out here. I have all this cattle. We're going to be forever. You go on ahead, and we'll follow you. I don't think he was scared at this point. He's just practically saying, let's do this. And Esau said, Let me now leave with thee some of the folk with me. And he said, What needeth it? Let me find grace in the sight of my Lord. So Esau says, that's fine, but I'm going to leave some people that I brought with me behind just to protect you. Really, they're restoring their relationship, and that's a big deal. We're going to see that in a few minutes. So Esau returned that day on his way unto Seir, and Jacob returned to Succoth and built him an house and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth. And Jacob came to Shalom, the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Paddan Aram, and pitched his tent before the city, and he bought a parcel of a field where he had spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And he erected there an altar, and he called it Eloleh Israel. Now, Esau insisted that he didn't need anything from Jacob, but Jacob insists, no, I have this stuff and it's for you. It reminds me, I've seen this conversation take place many times with Leanne, okay? And usually it's over not a huge amount of money, maybe $10, and she will have bought something for a friend of hers for $10, and they're trying to pay her back. Or maybe a friend of hers goes and buys something for $10, and so Leanne's like, okay, how much was that $10? I'm going to pay you back. And they sit there and argue about it. And Leanne's like, no, I'm not taking your money. And they're like, no, you have to. You bought it. And Leanne's like, no, I'm not. And they're fighting back and forth. And sometimes, there have actually been times it drives Leanne crazy. Eventually, I'll stand up in the middle and be like, hey, if neither of you want the $10, just give it to me and I'll take it. But apparently it doesn't go over well, so I kind of learned my lesson. Don't do it that way. But that's what's happening here. God had richly blessed both of the brothers. Both of these brothers are now wealthy and they have all this stuff. And they finally make peace. Now they're like, hey, no, you take it. No, you take it. Okay, well, you go on ahead and we'll protect you from the back. No, we're going to be slow, so you go on ahead. Well, I'm going to leave some people behind to protect you. We see a good relationship because of the forgiveness developing between Esau and Jacob. And the thing that struck me about that is this. For really the rest of their lives and for hundreds of years to come, that's exactly what we see. Jacob and Esau never had the major fights like we see so many biblical characters have, especially ones that we see that could potentially have these problems. In fact, hundreds of years later, after Jacob and his whole family go to Egypt, they were slaves in Egypt for a couple hundred years, and then God delivers them with Moses, sends them back to back to the Promised Land. He tells them in Deuteronomy 2, you're about to enter the region of Seir, the same region that we see mentioned here in Genesis 33, where Esau settled. And he says, when you get there, you're going to encounter a group of people called the Edomites. The Edomites were the descendants of Esau. And he's like, when you get to the Edomites, they're the one group of people. I want you just to walk around. Don't fight them. Don't try to overthrow them. Don't drive them from their homes. Just make peace with them and move on. And that's exactly what Israel does. Now, it doesn't last very long. The Edomites eventually ended up picking all kinds of fights with the Israelites. And then there was another descendant of Esau whose name was Amalek. If you've ever heard of him, the Amalekites came from him, and they had all kinds of problems, a whole lot more than even Edomites did. But regardless, because Esau and Jacob decided, as much as we have every reason to fight and have contention and not get along and have this kind of long-term fight going on, we are going to pursue peace. God allowed peace to be between Esau and Jacob and their descendants for almost 500 years. Reminding me of one more verse, and we'll go over this and then we'll finish up the message. But 1 Peter 3, 10 through 11. The Bible says, for he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil, and his lips that they speak no guile. So he says, hey, if you love life, if you want to have a nice, good life, watch your mouth. Watch what you say. It says, let him eschew evil and do good. So avoid doing wrong and instead pursue doing what's good. And then it says, let him seek peace and ensue it. That word ensue is kind of a dead, archaic type word. We don't use it today. But it means pursue, follow after. Do everything you can to achieve peace. Now, are there times when peace is not an option? Yes, we understand that. Whether you're talking about on a geopolitical scale, on a familiar, personal scale, even with certain churches that we just simply could not have fellowship with. But if there is an opportunity to have peace with someone around us, we should always try to do that. We would be wise to do that because that's what God commands us to do. And we see that when Jacob and Esau pursued that peace, God used it to bless them for hundreds of years as a result.